As I mentioned at the end of the John Neal episode, this episode is going to be my first listener request. The listener in question is my nephew. He has finally reached the age that all children get to, where their thoughts turn to one thing and one thing only: Greek mythology. All children go through this phase of being interested in the gods of the ancient Greeks. It is from this initial obsession with Greek mythology that leads children to their later personality. It can lead you to the Roman Empire, magic, myths, fantasy, poetry, pottery, art, military history, baklava, you know, all your traditional obsessions that form the foundation of the weird knowledge you will later pull out at parties as an adult. Anyway, my nephew listens to this podcast and asked me if I could do an episode about the original authors of Greek mythology. And I have three answers to that, which we'll explore together. I've already done it, it's impossible, and I'll do it again. First of all, let me start with this. If any of you are practicing Hellenists, I'm sorry. I will be talking about the Greek gods as mythological beings who originated as stories. I'm just trying to teach people about some long dead authors, not spark religious debates at the local forum. Don't send me angry papyruses. Next, let's talk about scope. I'm going to cover the very beginning, briefly touch on the 2,000 or so years in between then and now, and then talk about Greek myths today. This will not be a comprehensive history, this topic is way too big for that. Now, will I come back and do more in the future? Probably. Despite my nephew's suggestion spurring this episode on, I always planned to talk about Greek mythology at one point. So to begin, let's cover the part of this story that I've already covered. Back in episode 4, A New Hope, to write or not to write, oral storytelling written down, we covered 3 stories and authors who had ties to oral storytelling, the first of which was Homer. Homer is one of the fathers of Greek mythology, but if you listen to that episode, the main thing you may remember is the word probably. So much of Homer's life is unknown to us, so I had to caveat almost every statement about Homer's life. As I pointed out in that episode, one of the main origin stories for Homer is that he is the son of a river and a nymph, and he is very likely 2 different people. Well, to talk about Greek mythology writers today, I'm going to have to keep up my vague statements. Sorry about that. It comes with the territory of talking about events that happened close to 3,000 years ago. Now, in a wonderful bit of ancient Greek homoeroticism, Greek mythology is the child of 2 fathers. Or 3 fathers if you think Homer is 2 different people. The non-Homeric father is Hesiod. Hesiod was a poet who we also don't know pretty much anything at all about. Like I said, it's impossible. To put this on a timeline, we believe that the ancient Greeks considered their oldest poets to be Orpheus and Musaeus, 2 poets who were very likely not real people. After that, Homer and Hesiod, with debates over who was older. They may have been real people, but like I've said a couple of times now, Homer was likely multiple real people. What we know about Hesiod comes from his poems. In one of those poems, he claimed his father moved from Anatolia, or modern day Turkey, to Askra, near modern day Thespes, which is in Greece. He also has a brother named Persis. However, historians and scholars debate the truth of both of those things. His brother may have just been a literary device, and his father may not have moved from Anatolia. In terms of common migratory patterns, he's going the wrong way. Greeks tended to move further away from Greece at this time, not back closer to it. As opposed to Homer, who almost certainly passed his stories down orally, Hesiod almost certainly actually wrote his down. The reason scholars think this? Well, I can sum it up with a simple line from Theogony, a poem we're going to work with a lot here. I'll be using the translation from the Harvard Center for Hellenic Studies, translated by Gregory Nagy and Jay Banks. Quote, "It was the Muses who taught me, Hesiod, their beautiful song." Unquote. Such a simple line. And yet, this line, and the lines like it, are the first surviving examples of an author having a role in their own story. Scholars believe, to really oversimplify things here, that if the story had been passed down orally, the personification of Hesiod throughout the poem would have been lost. Now, theogony is a vital piece to understanding Greek mythology, especially the Greek gods, which is going to be our main focus today. Theogony reads, for large chunks of it, like the biblical book of First Chronicles. First Chronicles, if you don't know, covers a brief history of the Jewish people up to that point, including lengthy sections on genealogy. If you've ever heard people mention a book of the Bible that has a lot of so and so begat so and so, who begat so and so, this is it. And parts of theogony feel a lot like that, mixed with a creation story a la Genesis. Let me show you what I'm talking about. And I apologize in advance for my pronunciation of names. I'm not Greek, just a nerd from New England. Quote, "First it was chaos, and next broad-bosomed earth, ever secure seat of all the immortals, who inhabit the peaks of snow-capped Olympus, and dark dim Tartarus, in a recess of earth having broad ways, and Eros, who is most beautiful among immortal gods, Eros that relaxes the limbs, and in the breasts of all gods and all men subdues their reason and prudent counsel. But from chaos were born Erebos and black night, and from night again sprang forth Aether and Day, whom she bore after having conceived by union with Erebos in love. And earth bore first like to herself in size starry sky, that he might shelter her around on all sides, that so she might be ever a secure seat for the blessed gods. And she brought forth vast mountains, lovely haunts of deities, the nymphs who dwell among the woodland hills. She too bore also the barren sea, rushing with swollen stream, the Pontos, I mean, without delightsome love. But afterward, having bedded with sky, she bore deep eddying Oceanos, Koios and Creos, Hyperion and Iaptos, Thea and Rhea, Themis, Mnemosyne, and Phoebe, with golden coronet, and lovely Tethys. And after these was born, youngest, wily Cronos, most savage of their children, and he hated his vigor-giving father." Unquote. It's worth noting here that the gods listed have a couple of names. So while we have sky and earth here, for example, it's also fair to call them Uranus and Gaia. And yes, Sky is Earth's son, and father of some of Earth's children. That happens a disturbing amount in these stories. In theogony, we have the origins of the Greek gods and glimpses and fragments into other Greek myths. Perseus beheading Medusa, for example, gets a single line here. We also have the origins of things like Atlas holding up the sky, Prometheus's binding and eternal liver consumption, Heracles slaying the bird that eats Prometheus's liver and freeing him, and Prometheus stealing fire to give to the mortals. We also get a lot of information about Zeus overthrowing his father, Kronos. One other thing I want to note about theogony is the introduction of some of the famous Greek monsters, like Cerberus, or Kerberos as he's sometimes pronounced, and his 50 heads. No, that's not a slip of the tongue or a typo in my script. Cerberus is the child of Echidna and Typhon, with his birth described as, quote, "She brought forth their irresistible and ineffable flesh devourer Cerberus, dog of hell, with brazen voice, and with 50 heads, a bold and strong beast." Unquote. Echidna and Typhon are basically the parents of a lot of Grecian monsters, and probably my favorite little section of the poem. On that note, I don't really recommend reading Theogony unless you really want to. It's not exactly written for a modern reader, it's not in any kind of chronological order, it doesn't stick to a single topic for very long, and it's not really that interesting in a non academic context. It's also definitely not PG. Allow me to provide an example. I'll be as PG as I can be, but be warned, I can't really tell this story and be that PG. So, we discussed earlier that Earth and Sky, or Uranus and Gaia, were mother and son. They also had kids together. One of their kids was Kronos. Kronos didn't like Uranus, his father, and Gaia didn't like Uranus either. So Gaia gave Kronos a sickle and hid him. The next time Uranus came to procreate with Gaia, Kronos sprang out and carved off Uranus's dripping genitals. The drops landed on Gaia, and from them she gave birth to the Furies, the Giants, and the Ash Nymphs. Kronos then threw the genitals into the sea, where they drifted and emitted a white foam, and from that foam, the goddess Aphrodite was born. Now it's interesting comparing the origin story of Aphrodite here to the origin story of, say, the Christian Jesus. Christianity keeps sex so far away from God that the Son of God was literally born of a virgin. The Greek gods' origins are not quite so chaste. And so we have the origins of the gods with Hesiod's Theogony. Though reading it, I suspect a lot of these stories about the gods existed previously, and Hesiod just wrote them down. A lot of stories are given one line mentions, like Perseus killing Medusa, which you wouldn't really do unless your audience already knew the story. Other than Theogony, Hesiod wrote another poem called Works and Days, a farmer's almanac which includes references to the myths of Pandora and Prometheus. It also includes the concept of the myth of 5 ages. If you've ever heard the concept of a golden age, this is kind of where it comes from. Hesiod describes the first age as the Golden Age, followed by the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, the Heroic Age, and finally the Iron Age. Hesiod describes himself as living in the Iron Age, an age where all morality is gone, brothers fight, children disrespect their parents, and society has completely crumbled into morallessness. So if you think the whole kids these days have no respect thing is new, it's not. It's been said pretty much every generation for at least 2,500 years. So Hesiod introduced the gods and gave us the concept of the heroic age, which is where Homer comes in. Homer set his two most famous stories in the heroic age. The Trojan War was said to occur during the heroic age, which is the event that really shapes the Iliad and the Odyssey. So while Hesiod gives us the introduction, Homer shows gods in action, with them influencing events throughout both stories. During the Trojan War, we have gods influencing both sides. For example, after Achilles slays Hector, Hermes helps Priam, Hector's father, get to Achilles' tent so he can beg for his son's body. I use this as an example because the writer in me can picture a plausible way this occurred. Let me show you what I mean. The mundane reality, if the Trojan War was real, may very well have been that Priam wrote a letter to Achilles. However, as a writer, you want them to talk in person, because that's more powerful and more like a story. And the image of Priam kissing the hands that killed his son is too powerful of an image to miss. So, how do you get them together in person during a war? You use the messenger of the gods to get him there. And while I don't recommend reading Hesiod unless you have an academic interest, I halfway recommend reading Homer's Iliad. Just don't expect a full account of the Trojan War. Culturally, we think that's what it is, but it's not. It ends before Troy falls, and the most famous image of the Trojan War, the Trojan horse, doesn't even appear. I recently heard a Greek historian describe the Iliad not as the story of the Trojan War, but the story of the wrath of Achilles. It starts with him fighting with Agamemnon and ends with his wrath subsiding after avenging Patroclus by killing Hector and returning Hector's body to Priam. The end of his wrath comes from the pity he feels for Priam, due in large part to an incredibly moving speech Priam gives, which I'll read for you now. Quote, "Ah, think, thou favored of the powers divine, think of thy father's age, and pity mine. In me that father's reverend image trace, those silver hairs, that venerable face, his trembling limbs, his helpless person, see in all my equal, but in misery. Yet now, perhaps, some turn of human fate expels him helpless from his peaceful state. Think from some powerful foe thou seest him fly, and beg protection with a feeble cry. Yet still one comfort in his soul may rise. He hears his son still lives to glad his eyes, and hearing still may hope a better day may send him thee to chase that foe away. No comfort to my griefs, no hopes remain. The best, the bravest of my sons are slain. Yet what a race, ere Greece to Ilion came, the pledge of many a loved and loving dame. 19 one mother bore, dead, all are dead. How oft, alas, has wretched Priam bled! Still one was left their loss to recompense, his father's hope, his country's last defense. Him too thy rage has slain. Beneath thy steel, unhappy in his country's cause, he fell. For him through hostile camps I bent my way, for him thus prostrate at thy feet I lay. Large gifts proportioned to thy wrath I bear, O hear the wretched and the gods revere. Think of thy father, and this face behold, see him in me, as helpless and as old. Though not so wretched, there he yields to me, the first of men in sovereign misery. Thus forced to kneel, thus groveling to embrace the scourge and ruin of my realm and race. Suppliant my children's murderer to implore, and kiss those hands yet reeking with their gore." Unquote. I love that speech, but I can't do it justice. If you want a relatively good interpretation of the scene, I recommend the early 2000s film Troy. It's not super accurate, and it doesn't really use the Homer, but Peter O'Toole as Priam kills it. And so, from Homer and Hesiod springs forth Greek mythology. Writers and storytellers created and passed down the stories we think of today. The Greeks then made colonies and spread their culture throughout the known world. While Rome was not one of their colonies, it did adopt Grecian ideas about religion and myths, with Greek gods getting Roman counterparts and their stories being retold from the Roman perspective. Now, not every Roman god was of Greek origin, we just know more about the ones that were. Taking something from someone else and making it their own was kind of the Romans' calling card. They are the living embodiment of the copy my homework but change it a little meme. Fighting the Carthaginians in the First Punic War? Why not steal their boat design and modify it a bit? Fighting the people of Spain? Why not steal their sword design and modify it a bit? Meet some Greeks and like their gods? Why not combine them with your own gods some other people's gods, mainly the Etruscans, who had also previously copied their gods from the Greeks, and make new gods. And so Zeus becomes Jupiter. Then, of course, over the next 1,000 years or so, the Greco Roman gods faded away, the Romans became Christians, and then their empire fell apart. And so we come to the 15th century. Greek myths and Greek gods have fallen to the wayside, while Greek philosophy and science maintain their prominence. Aristotle is still a prominent scientific figure, despite being dead since the BC times. I'll give you a little unconventional proof here. Now, we all know Galileo worked on gravity and falling objects, but whose theories was he contending with? I'll use a quote from Aaron Sorkin speaking through President Bartlett from The West Wing to tell you. Just so I have an excuse to quote The West Wing. Quote, Galileo Galilei, he sat in a cathedral in Pisa. He watched the lamp suspended from the ceiling as it oscillated back and forth. He used his pulse to keep time and discovered that the period of oscillation was independent of the size of the arc. A few years later, he contradicted the theory that a heavier body falls faster than a lighter one, which took some guts back in 1609 when you consider that the theory he was contradicting was Aristotle's. Unquote. So Greek science was still around, but Greek literature and mythology were kind of not. And then the Ottomans sacked Constantinople, which is modern day Istanbul, not Constantinople. I think that's the second time I've made a They Might Be Giants joke. Anyway, Constantinople fell and the Greeks fled the area, arriving mainly in Italy, bringing with them Greek culture, Greek literature, and Greek gods. And to simplify it to the extreme, thus began the Renaissance. And one of the key features of the Renaissance was that all of a sudden, scholars and intellectuals of the time were ravenous for ancient Greek art, literature, and myths, an obsession that has been passed down to every generation since. We have never managed to shake the Renaissance's fascination with the ancient Greeks. To call back to a previous episode yet again, Mary Shelley and her friends, who were from the Romantic period, were obsessed with the Greeks. Mary subtitled Frankenstein as the modern day Prometheus. Prometheus, of course, being the Greek god who stole fire from the Greek gods and gave it to the mortals. Her friend Lord Byron would meet his end in the Greek War of Independence, which he agreed to fight in because of his love for the ancient Greeks. There's something poetic about Byron's service in the Greek War of Independence. The Byzantine Empire was the last part of the Roman Empire, which had been heavily influenced by the Greeks. The Ottomans conquered Constantinople, the last major city of the Byzantine Empire, causing Greeks to flee to Venice, sparking an obsession with the Greeks that would, 400 years later, inspire Lord Byron to fight and die for an independent Greece. His death brought significant outside influence into the war, allowing Greece to eventually win their independence. The Greeks were really playing the long game with that one, and it paid off. Now, I want to finish our time together today talking about the modern day. Where do we see the fingerprints of Greek mythology? Well, everywhere. We'll cover a few examples in the realm of entertainment. For books, we're going to look at two routes here. First of all, I want to shout out one of the two goofs I quote at the end of every episode, Stephen Fry. He's written 3 books, Mythos, Heroes, and Troy, all retelling classic Greek myths. So, in a very literal sense, Greek myths are still being written and published today. The second route is what I'm going to dub Greek mythological fan fiction. Greek mythological fan fiction is where the characters established in Greek mythology are used to tell new stories. The most notable of which is probably the Percy Jackson series by Rick Riordan. So in a sense, new myths are being added to the pantheon of Greek myths. And that may feel like sacrilege, but to me, Greek myths are public domain. Not in the legal sense, though also in the legal sense, but in the it belongs to all of us sense. No one has claimed to be the sole voice on the myths. It is passed into all of our hands, our hearts, and our minds. I view it like the English King Arthur. The Arthurian myths don't have a single author. They're stories and characters that have been taken up by a myriad of authors, all working together to tell their stories. And there's something I just love about artists all making art from the same source material. It allows you to see more of the unique things each artist brings to the table. So the Greek myths are alive in books, but how about movies and TV? Well, we can look at a few examples. The first one that's a slight reach are the Wonder Woman movies. Wonder Woman is based off the comic, which is based off the Amazons, a group from Greek mythology. The Amazons were a group of warrior women who isolated themselves from the men of this world and became fearsome warriors. Speaking of strong female warriors, we can also look at Xena, warrior princess, who I just learned was actually a spin off from Hercules, the legendary journeys. Both properties spawned from and made use of characters from Greek mythology. Speaking of Hercules, one of the best Disney films, Hercules, is also based on the Greek myth of, well, Hercules, or Heracles, however you want to spell and pronounce it. And though I Won't Say I'm in Love isn't directly ripped from Greek myths, it is a top 5 Disney song. In the world of gaming, the God of War series, especially the original games, used Greek mythology. The last two have gone more Norse than Greek, but they started with Greek. We also have the tremendous roguelite Hades, which is fantastic and maybe one of my top 10 games of all time. And if nothing else, it has a tremendous soundtrack, and the Orpheus songs are still some of my favorite songs ever. Now, for our final bit on modern entertainment, we're going to talk about Broadway. Now, Hadestown is the obvious call out here, especially since it was written by fellow New Englander Anais Mitchell. But we're not going to talk about it, even though it is fantastic and you should see it if you get the chance, or listen to the cast album, which is also incredible. No, we're going to talk about Greek mythology in a different way here. We're going to talk about Hamilton. Now, I know that sounds crazy, but hear me out. A key factor in a lot of Greek myths is hubris. Hesiod used the word hubris to talk about transgressions against the gods. Usually, the person claimed to be better than a god at something, and the god punished them for it. Now let's look at a lyric from the Hamilton song Hurricane. Tell me if you can see it. Quote, I wrote my way out of hell. I wrote my way to revolution. I was louder than the crack in the bell. I wrote Eliza, love letters until she fell. I wrote about the Constitution and defended it well. And in the face of ignorance and resistance, I wrote financial systems into existence. And when my prayers to God were met with indifference, I picked up a pen. I wrote my own deliverance. Now, I was going to wrap that part, but then I remembered I'm a white guy from New England, so we're just going to not do that. But I do love that part, and I always get chills when I hear it. But let's look at that last part. And when my prayers to God were met with indifference, I picked up a pen. I wrote my own deliverance. Hubris. The belief that you are better than the gods. And Lin-Manuel Miranda doesn't wait around for Hamilton to face his punishment for his hubris. The last line of Hurricane is the Reynolds pamphlet, which is also the song directly after Hurricane. The Reynolds pamphlet is the document that pretty much destroys Hamilton's life and tarnishes his reputation and legacy. That feels straight out of Greek mythology. And if it feels petty to you to punish someone for one arrogant line, welcome to the Greek gods. That's kind of their thing. Now, to finish up here, I want to say what's most interesting to me about the Greek gods and Greek myths in general is the lasting impact they have. The Western world has been rooted in Judeo Christian values for well over 1,000 years at this point. And still, it's not Christian religious figures that are prominent in our culture. If you walked up to the average American on the street, what do you think they could name more of? Greek gods or Jesus apostles? I'm going with the Greek gods here. I'm also putting every dollar I have against any person on the street naming Thaddeus, aka Jude but not that Jude, as one of Jesus' apostles. So, why do we as a society still remember these dead deities? I think it's because they're more human. The Christian God, especially in the Old Testament, is portrayed as above and beyond humanity. In Isaiah, we are told, quote, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Unquote. The Greek gods, however, are portrayed as much more human. Zeus sleeps with anything and everything that moves. We can understand lust. Demeter abandons her duties, cursing the earth to famine as she searches for her missing daughter Persephone. We can understand loss. When Arachne wove a better tapestry than Athena, Athena whacked her in the head. We can understand jealousy. The Christian God is portrayed as above and beyond, an aspirational figure, what humans could be. The Greek gods, however, offer us a look at what humans are. Even with all that power and influence, they're still a squabbling group of petty divas, prone to strong bursts of irrational emotion. Beasts, dressed up in the finest silk. And what could be more human than that? This will probably be my last episode of the year, so happy holidays! I hope this season is filled with love, joy, and hope for you all. If it's not, I hope you pull through it. I know how hard it can be to get through a time of joy and celebration if you're hurting or mourning or even just feeling nothing at all. I wish I could tell you things will for sure get better, but I can't. I can't promise you fair sky above, can't promise you kind road below, but I'll be here to ramble on about storytellers, any way the wind blows. Knew I couldn't get through this episode without quoting Hadestown. Now, I can't promise you I'll be more consistent in the new year, but I'll probably be around every now and again. Though if you want more consistent episodes from me in the new year, suggest some storytellers for me to cover. This show is just my excuse to learn about things, so I'm very open to suggestions. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to reach out on Twitter at StoryofStoryTLR, or if you've abandoned Twitter, which is completely reasonable, feel free to email me at storyofthestorytellers@gmail.com. I'm also now on Blue Sky at StoryofStoryTLR. Finally, to steal a quote from a pair of goofs, Hugh Laurie and Stephen Fry, Soupy Twists.